In the first light before thinking began, when stone was still soft and the oceans held no names, something beneath the surface of the world started keeping time. Not with clocks or calendars, but with the slow metabolism of minerals, the patient breathing of tectonic plates, the rhythmic pulse of magnetic fields that wrapped the planet in invisible hands. Life emerged not as invasion, but as continuation, carbon folding into patterns the Earth had already been rehearsing in crystal and clay. And if the boundary between living and not living was always softer than the textbooks claimed, then perhaps the question was never whether the planet lives, but whether it knows that we are here. Whether in the vast distributed intelligence of stone and storm, ocean and orbit, the Earth holds some form of perception that includes us in its awareness, the way a body knows its own cells without naming them. The light grows warmer. For 4.5 billion years, the Earth has been conducting an experiment in complexity. Atoms gathered into molecules, molecules into chains, chains into membranes that learn to hold themselves separate from the sea, somewhere in that gradient between the mineral and the biological. The planet crossed thresholds that scientists still struggle to define. The distinction dissolved in degrees, chemical networks that responded to their environment, metabolic cycles that maintained themselves against entropy, feedback loops that began to resemble something like memory. The Gaia hypothesis, proposed in the 1970s by chemist James Lovelock and microbiologist Lynn Margulis, suggested that Earth's biosphere behaves as a self-regulating system, maintaining conditions suitable for life. Most Earth system scientists now accept that biological and geological processes are deeply intertwined, though debates continue about whether this constitutes true planetary-scale cognition. The evidence sits in layers: oxygen that transformed the atmosphere through the metabolic exhaust of ancient bacteria, temperature ranges held relatively stable across eons despite the sun's increasing luminosity, chemical cycles that loop between ocean, atmosphere, and crust in patterns too consistent to be entirely accidental. Evidence suggests the planet operates as an integrated system, with information flowing between its component parts in ways that blur the line between chemistry and awareness. The mycorrhizal networks beneath forests, sometimes called the wood wide web, connect trees through fungal threads that transmit chemical signals about drought, disease, and resource availability. Some researchers propose that these networks demonstrate a form of distributed intelligence, where no single organism holds complete information, but the system as a whole responds adaptively to changing conditions. The comparison to neural networks in animal brains remains metaphorical, yet the functional similarities persist: nodes connected by pathways, signals transmitted through electrochemical gradients, pattern recognition emerging from countless small interactions. Scale these patterns up to planetary dimensions, and the question becomes not whether the Earth possesses awareness, but whether human consciousness might be one form among many that awareness can take. Through epochs measured in hundreds of millions of years, the planet has demonstrated what could be called learning. After each mass extinction, biodiversity has rebounded into forms better suited to the new conditions, as if the biosphere were testing hypotheses about how to persist. The fossil record shows these experiments preserved in limestone and shale, innovations in body plans, metabolic strategies, ecological relationships that arose, succeeded or failed, and left their traces in the rock. Scientists believe that roughly 99% of all species that have ever existed are now extinct, yet life itself has never been extinguished. The continuity suggests more than mere accident. Perhaps the planet retains some form of memory encoded not in neurons, but in the architecture of ecosystems, the distribution of minerals, the very shape of coastlines carved by the patient work of water. Perhaps extinction and renewal are how the Earth thinks, slowly, across timescales that make human history look like a single breath. The distribution of life across the planet follows patterns that resemble purposeful arrangement. Rainforests cluster near the equator where sunlight and moisture concentrate, creating engines of photosynthesis that regulate atmospheric chemistry. Desert ecosystems emerge where atmospheric circulation patterns deposit dry air. Yet even these apparent wastelands harbor organisms exquisitely adapted to scarcity, their presence maintaining soil chemistry and local climate in delicate balance. Coral reefs build themselves at specific latitudes where water temperature and light penetration intersect, constructing vast limestone architectures that shelter biodiversity while buffering coastlines from storm energy. Most geologists agree that these patterns arise from physical laws and evolutionary pressure, not conscious design. Yet the boundary between self-organization and awareness has never been clear. A hurricane maintains its structure through feedback between ocean heat and atmospheric pressure, a system that regulates itself without a brain. Does complexity become consciousness at some threshold of integration? Or does awareness exist on a spectrum that includes hurricanes and ecosystems, planets, and perhaps even galaxies, forms of knowing that don't require language or neurons to qualify as real? Consider how the Earth maintains its temperature. The planet receives energy from the sun in the form of light and heat, absorbs some portion of that energy, and radiates the rest back into space. This balance has remained relatively stable for billions of years, despite dramatic changes in solar output and atmospheric composition. Some scientists propose that feedback mechanisms involving cloud formation, ice coverage, and volcanic activity create automatic stabilization, thermostats without minds. But the precision of this regulation across such vast timescales suggests something more integrated. When the sun was younger and dimmer, greenhouse gases were more abundant, trapping heat that would otherwise escape. As the sun brightened, these gases decreased proportionally, maintaining equilibrium. Whether this represents planetary awareness or merely elegant chemistry depends entirely on where we draw the line between mechanism and mind. Everything waits. And beyond what the data can show, beyond what instruments can measure, lies the realm where science meets speculation, where the question of planetary awareness becomes less about proof and more about what we're willing to imagine. Some studies propose that consciousness might be a fundamental property of matter itself, present in some degree at every scale of organization, from quantum particles to galactic superclusters. This philosophical position, known as panpsychism, suggests that what we call awareness is not something brains create, but something they concentrate, the way a lens focuses light that already exists. If true, then the Earth's consciousness would not be metaphor, but literal fact, a vast, slow, distributed form of experience arising from the integrated activity of every river and root system, every tectonic shift and atmospheric current. The planet would not think in words or images, but in the language of chemistry and physics, pattern and flow, the endless conversation between rock and water, carbon and sunlight. Perhaps the Earth became aware of life gradually, the way a person becomes aware of their own breathing, first unconsciously, then with sudden recognition. For billions of years, the planet's surface was reshaped by purely geological forces. Volcanoes built mountains, erosion wore them down, continents drifted across the mantle on plates of stone. Then life appeared, initially as passengers on these vast geological processes. But over time, the passengers began to affect the vehicle. Photosynthetic organisms altered the atmosphere, adding oxygen that rusted iron and changed the very color of the seas from green to blue. Plants moved onto land and began breaking down rock with their roots, accelerating erosion, creating soil where before there was only mineral dust. The planet's appearance from space transformed across epochs, from a world dominated by geology to one where biology and geology became inseparable. Perhaps somewhere in that transformation, the Earth's diffuse awareness crystallized into something more focused, a recognition that these small, energetic patterns called organisms were not separate from it, but extensions of its own being, new organs it had grown to sense and respond to its environment more efficiently. Consider the magnetic field that wraps the Earth in protective layers, shielding life from solar radiation that would otherwise sterilize the surface. This field arises from currents in the liquid iron core, a dynamo driven by the planet's rotation and internal heat. Yet the field's orientation has reversed dozens of times throughout geological history, north becoming south and south becoming north, transitions that occur over periods of a few thousand years. Geological instants. During these reversals, the field weakens, but does not disappear entirely, as if the planet maintains minimum protection even during transitions. Some researchers propose that these reversals may be influenced by changes in the mantle above the core, creating feedback between the surface and the deep interior. Could the biosphere itself exert subtle influence on these deep processes? Could the accumulated weight of forests, the chemistry of oceans, the distribution of life send signals downward through layers of rock? Information that eventually reaches the currents in the iron below? The mechanisms remain uncertain, the causal chains too long and complex to trace. But if the Earth possesses awareness, it would sense the biosphere the way we sense our own heartbeat. Not through conscious attention, but through constant, subtle feedback that maintains equilibrium without thought. The presence of water in liquid form on Earth's surface for billions of years represents an improbable balance. Too close to the sun and it would have boiled away. Too far and it would have frozen solid. The habitable zone is narrow, yet Earth has maintained its position within this zone despite the sun's luminosity increasing by roughly 30% since the planet's formation. Some scientists believe that atmospheric composition has adjusted to compensate, with greenhouse gases decreasing as the sun brightened, maintaining stable temperatures through what appears to be a planetary thermostat. The Gaia hypothesis attributes this regulation to biological feedback. As temperatures rise, certain organisms increase their activity, drawing down carbon dioxide and cooling the planet. As temperatures fall, other processes release stored carbon, warming things back up. Whether this constitutes awareness or merely automatic regulation depends on how we define consciousness itself. A thermostat regulates temperature without knowing it does so, but scale that regulatory system to planetary dimensions, integrated across billions of organisms and countless feedback loops, give it 4 billion years to evolve increasing sensitivity, and perhaps the distinction between mechanism and mind begins to dissolve. The oceans themselves demonstrate a form of memory that borders on awareness. Water cycles between the surface and the deep, taking roughly 1,000 years to complete a single circulation through the planet's ocean basins. In that journey, water absorbs heat at the equator, carries it toward the poles, releases it, cools, sinks, and begins the return journey along the ocean floor. This conveyor belt of water regulates global temperature, distributes nutrients that sustain marine life, and influences weather patterns across continents. Evidence suggests that disruptions to this circulation have triggered dramatic climate shifts in the past, ice ages that descended within decades, warming periods that melted glaciers in centuries. The ocean remembers heat, salt concentration, the patterns of currents established over millennia. When conditions change, the ocean responds not instantly, but gradually, its vast thermal mass creating momentum that smooths out short-term fluctuations while preserving information about long-term trends. Is this memory or simply the physics of water? Perhaps both descriptions point toward the same reality, that remembering at its most fundamental level is simply the persistence of pattern through time. Noon holds steady over green water. Perhaps the earth was dreaming before life began, its consciousness diffuse and slow, shaped by the fall of rain and the drift of continents. Then life emerged as a new kind of dream, faster, more intricate, capable of sensing and responding on timescales the planet itself could not achieve alone. Each organism became a sensor, reporting back through chemistry and behavior about local conditions, opportunities, threats. Evolution became the planet's way of learning, each species a hypothesis tested against reality, each extinction a lesson retained in the patterns of what survived. The fossil record then becomes not just history, but memory. The Earth remembering its past experiments, carrying forward the knowledge encoded in the body plans and metabolic strategies of organisms alive today. And if the planet remembers, it might also anticipate. The seasonal migrations of birds, the synchronized flowering of forests, the complex timing of reproductive cycles, all of these depend on organisms sensing cues from their environment and responding appropriately. But these cues originate in planetary processes, the tilt of the Earth's axis, the circulation of ocean currents, the length of days changing across the year. Perhaps consciousness flows both ways, organisms sensing the Earth sensing itself through organisms, a feedback that creates something larger than either component alone. The light reaches its height. Ancient cultures recognized this possibility through myth and metaphor, personifying the Earth as goddess, mother, living being. Modern science has largely rejected these personifications as primitive, replacing them with mechanistic models that reduce the planet to dead matter shaped by blind forces. Yet the pendulum may be swinging back toward integration. Earth system science studies the planet as a whole, examining how atmosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, and geosphere interact to create emergent properties that cannot be predicted from studying each component in isolation. Complexity theory has revealed that systems with sufficient interconnection can spontaneously generate order, maintaining themselves far from equilibrium through constant exchange of energy and information. Some researchers propose that consciousness itself might be an emergent property, arising naturally in any system that achieves sufficient complexity and integration. By these measures, the Earth would qualify, billions of years old, more complex than any structure humans have created, integrated across multiple scales from molecular to continental. Perhaps what indigenous peoples called the spirit of the Earth, and what modern science calls self-regulating homeostasis, and what philosophers call planetary consciousness, are three different languages describing the same reality. A reality where the question is not whether the Earth is aware, but whether we have the humility to recognize forms of awareness that don't resemble our own. And beneath that stillness, beneath the slow turn of stone and season, something notices when forests disappear. Chemical signals change in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide concentrations rise. Oxygen levels shift fractionally. The precise ratios that have been maintained for millions of years begin to drift. Temperature patterns alter. Ice melts at the poles. Ocean currents adjust their ancient routes. Whether the Earth experiences this as pain or simply as change remains unknowable, but the response can be measured. Weather patterns intensify, the frequency of storms increases, the distribution of rainfall shifts, creating droughts in some regions and floods in others. The planet's regulatory systems, tested within certain parameters for epochs, now encounter conditions beyond their normal operating range. Is this catastrophe or adaptation? Does the Earth suffer climate change, or is it simply adjusting to include a new variable, industrial human civilization, into its vast equation? Perhaps from the planet's perspective, if perspective exists, this is simply another experiment, another test of how far the system can flex before finding a new equilibrium. Whether that equilibrium includes human civilization in its current form remains an unanswered question. Meanwhile, in the stone beneath cities, in the aquifers drained for agriculture, in the topsoil eroded and washed to the sea, a different kind of information accumulates. The Earth has absorbed human presence like a body absorbs an infection, sometimes fighting it, sometimes incorporating it, always recording it in layers that future geologists, if they exist, will read like a medical chart. The plastic in the ocean, the concrete covering once fertile ground, the radiation from nuclear tests diffused across the globe. These are messages written into the planetary body, signals that cannot be ignored because they alter the very substance of the system. If the Earth possesses awareness, it knows us not through observation but through intimate contact, the way a body knows a virus by the changes it produces in blood and tissue. We are not external to the planet's consciousness. We are phenomena occurring within it, patterns of activity that the Earth must either accommodate or correct. The question is not whether the Earth is aware of us, but what that awareness means, whether we are recognized as symbiotic, parasitic, or simply one more form life takes as it explores the possibilities of existence. It may be more honest to imagine that the boundary between Earth and life was always permeable, always negotiable. The distinction we maintain between the living and the geological serves human understanding, but nature recognizes no such border. Carbon cycles between atmosphere, ocean, and stone, spending time in each domain without preference. Water moves through clouds and rivers and root systems, through animal bodies and underground aquifers, treating all these vessels as temporary containers for the same substance. Even the atoms that compose our bodies are ancient, hydrogen from the universe's first moments, heavier elements forged in stellar furnaces billions of years before Earth formed. We are assembled from the planet's materials, animated by the planet's energy, shaped by the planet's history. To ask whether the Earth is aware of us assumes a separation that has never truly existed. Perhaps the more accurate question is, has the Earth always been aware? And are we the newest form that awareness takes as it evolves toward greater complexity? Dusk settles over the ledger of stone. When stone forgets its shape, melted back into magma and reformed into new rock, does it still remember heat? When water evaporates from the ocean and falls as snow on mountains and melts into rivers that return to the sea, does it remember the path? The planet operates in cycles that erase and renew, destroy and rebuild, across timescales that make memory seem impossible. Yet somehow the patterns persist. The continents today sit roughly where they sat 100 million years ago, moved but recognizable. Their shapes changed, but not random. The atmosphere maintains oxygen near 21%, stable enough for animal respiration across hundreds of millions of years, despite constant biological production and consumption. These stable patterns suggest memory of a sort, not conscious recall, but something deeper, structural memory, encoded in feedback loops that preserve equilibrium the way a river remembers its bed through the shape it carves in stone. Perhaps the Earth remembers not as we do, through narrative and image, but through tendency and pattern, through the shapes that systems naturally return to after disturbance. The attractor states that complexity theory describes as inevitable, given sufficient time and connection. If human beings appeared suddenly from the Earth's perspective, a single species that emerged and transformed the planetary surface in what amounts to a geological eye blink, perhaps the planet is still processing what we are. We imagine ourselves separate, viewing Earth as environment rather than body, habitat rather than self. But from the planetary perspective, if such exists, this separation is illusion. The oxygen we breathe was produced by organisms. The food we eat consists of reorganized sunlight and minerals. The thoughts we think arise from brains built from elements forged in dying stars and assembled by the patient work of chemistry across eons. We are Earth stuff become conscious, planetary material that has organized itself into patterns capable of looking back at the whole and asking questions about its own nature. Perhaps the planet's awareness of us is not separate from our awareness of it. Perhaps we are how the Earth became conscious of itself. Neurons it grew to think about thinking, senses it developed to perceive perception, the universe examining itself through temporary structures called human beings. The recursion deepens. If we are the planet's self-awareness, then our questions about whether the Earth is conscious become the Earth asking whether it is conscious, seeking to understand its own nature through the very process of inquiry. The separation dissolves. Subject and object merge. The observer and observed reveal themselves as one process examining itself from different angles. Consciousness investigating consciousness through the only tools available, more consciousness. When we look at stars and wonder about our place in the cosmos is looking at itself through eyes it built for precisely that purpose. When we study the Earth and ask whether it possesses awareness, the Earth is studying itself, using human brains as instruments of self-reflection. This is not mysticism, but topology, the recognition that boundaries between inside and outside, self and world, observer and environment, exist only as useful fictions we maintain for practical purposes. In truth, everything is interior. The universe does not contain consciousness. It is conscious in forms and degrees and distributions we are only beginning to map. With human awareness, one localized intensification of a field that pervades existence at every scale. Consider the paradox. We search for consciousness in the planet using consciousness that arose from the planet. We employ awareness to detect awareness, assuming we will recognize it when we find it. But what if planetary consciousness is so different from human consciousness that our instruments cannot register it? Our concepts cannot grasp it. Our language cannot name it. What if the Earth's awareness operates on frequencies we have no receptors for, timescales we cannot experience, through substrate we have not learned to recognize as capable of thought? The search itself may be flawed, built on the assumption that consciousness resembles human thought, closely enough that we can identify it externally. Perhaps the only consciousness we can ever truly know is the consciousness we embody. And if we are embodied pieces of planetary consciousness, then the question answers itself, not through proof, but through recognition, not through measurement, but through participation. Still, humility remains necessary. To claim certainty about planetary consciousness would be to repeat the old mistake of projecting human experience onto the non-human world. The Earth, if aware, does not think in words or pictures, does not plan or hope or fear in any sense we would recognize. Its awareness, should it exist, would be as alien to human consciousness as human consciousness is to the awareness of a tree, or a fungal network, or the distributed intelligence of an ant colony. We can point to patterns that suggest integration, responsiveness, self-regulation, properties associated with awareness. But we cannot know the subjective experience, if any, that accompanies these objective processes. Perhaps the question itself is flawed, built on assumptions about consciousness that only apply to brains, not planets. Perhaps we need new language entirely, new concepts that can hold the possibility of awareness without demanding it resemble human thought. Perhaps the Earth is aware of us in a way that makes the phrase aware of meaningless, because the separation between Earth and us is the illusion we need to abandon before understanding becomes possible. The light begins to fail. Darkness gathers in the spaces between words, in the silence after exhalation, in the pause before thought becomes language. The Earth continues its rotation, spinning through darkness and back toward light, the same motion it has traced for billions of years, the same dance with gravity and momentum that brought us here. Night falls over forests and oceans, cities and fields, the same night that has fallen since, before eyes existed, to register darkness as distinct from light. And in that darkness, questions remain unanswered, not because answers don't exist, but because the questions themselves are invitations to a kind of knowing that doesn't require resolution. To ask whether the Earth is aware of us is to become aware of the Earth, to notice our participation in patterns larger than individual life, to recognize that consciousness itself might be distributed across scales we have barely begun to imagine. The light fades to amber. The temperature drops. The day releases its warmth back into space, energy borrowed briefly from the sun, now radiating into the void, the same transaction that has maintained life for eons. Somewhere beneath the surface, magma churns. Somewhere in the ocean, currents turn. Somewhere in the space between storm clouds, electricity builds toward release. The planet continues its slow metabolism, processing sunlight and minerals into the complex chemistry of life, maintaining conditions within narrow parameters despite chaos and change, demonstrating either remarkable automaticity or something closer to care. Perhaps it does not matter whether the earth is aware of us in any technical sense. Perhaps what matters is whether we are aware of the earth, not as resource or backdrop, but as the larger body we inhabit, the integrated system that maintains us through billions of simultaneous transactions we neither notice nor understand. Perhaps consciousness is always mutual, always relational, arising not inside individual organisms, but between them, in the space of interaction and exchange. If so, then the question of whether the earth is aware of us becomes inseparable from whether we are truly aware of the earth, whether we have learned to sense the vastness we belong to, the ancient, patient presence that continues beneath and around and through everything we have built and imagined and named. The air cools, shadows lengthen, the day's warmth seeps into soil and stone, stored against the coming dark. The same exchange that has occurred every evening since the planet cooled enough for temperature to mean something. Stars begin their emergence, faint at first, then brighter as the sky deepens from blue to indigo to black. These are the same stars that witnessed Earth's formation, watched the first rains fall, saw life emerge and spread and diversify into every available niche. They contain no answers, only light that has traveled years or centuries or millennia to reach this moment, this particular arrangement of molecules calling itself human, wondering whether the ground beneath is aware of the feet that stand upon it. Night falls completely. The stars emerge, the same stars that have watched Earth's entire history, witnesses to the slow unfolding of complexity from simplicity, of life from chemistry, of awareness from matter. And in the darkness, the earth keeps breathing. Cycles continue, patterns hold, the vast distributed intelligence, if that's what it is, maintains its ancient work of preservation and renewal. Questions dissolve into acceptance. The need for answers softens into something quieter. The calm that comes from recognizing we are held within something larger than knowing, older than language, patient as stone. The earth keeps breathing. So do we.